Yes, welcome to the technical session 1B of 5th International Conference on ICT 4SD. Due to COVID-19, we all are going through a new normal phase, and the team of ICT 4SD wishes you a very safe and healthy time for you and your well-wishers. We are constantly trying to overcome the challenges that research community is facing at a different level. We at Global Knowledge Research Foundation are fully committed to contribute and enhance the digital experience in research activities. To continue further, this conference has received tremendous number of submission, which has across more than 1,000 plus number, 20 plus countries marked through direct submission and special sessions, out of which 340 papers were accepted by the technical review committee. And we were only able to accommodate 160 paper in a 2 volume of this year publication. Once again, we all would like to congratulate you for your research work and to be a part of this success story in a fifth version of conference. Further, I would like to welcome our session chair to take on the session. One is Dr. Prashant Dhotre and next second is Dr. Anubha Jain. Dr. Prashant Dhotre is an associate professor in the Department of IT and JPSM Rashri Sahu College of Engineering, Pune. He has over 15 years of teaching and research experience. He has also served as a reviewer for the various journals. And Dr. Anubha Jain is an associate professor and a head of Department of Computer Science and IT in IS University, Jaipur. She has more than 18 years of teaching experience. Her area of interest includes software engineering, algorithms, data structure, programming language, information architecture, e-banking, source transaction, and web applications. So now we can start our first presenter. So now we can start the presentations. Our first presenter is Ajit, Ajit Lal. Yes. Ajit Lal, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yes, Ajit, please present your presentation.
Yes, ma'am. And screen sharing is not working.
Screen share is not working.
Host has been disabled the participant for screen sharing.
Please check. Once again, please check.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Ajit, please start your presentation. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, Ajit,
Hello.
please start your
Madam.
presentation.
Yes, ma'am. Madam, is that screen is visible, ma'am?
Yes, your screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good morning, all viewers. Today I will learn on my paper enhanced performance of novel patch antenna subarray specifically used in the L-band ground receiver terminals linked into an aerospace platforms. And I am Achitlal, and I have three co-authors as Gandhiraj, Shanmugh Sundaram, and Pradeep Kumar. Hello.
Hello.
So, these are my contents, and our project objectives is to develop an enhanced array topology, which is mainly working in L band. So we choose the medium signal as 1.5 gigahertz as of we are using a 3D simulation tool, which for this simulation we use the computer simulated software for and this is on the for applications like cadence, navigation control, and for the flying of objects. And after simulating these parameters, we have to check the two parameters that we can to that half power beamwidth and valued reflection coefficient. That's the two values which the output we are given to main concentration as per the requirements. And later we have to develop and optimization algorithm, which is determine the width of patch antenna, because while we simulation this antenna using the theoretical formulas, we'll observe that there is a changing in the optimum frequency. So we like to making an algorithm for getting an patch width. Coming to the literature survey, we have to observe that there are many simulations in the specifically choosing the upper band like the S band or X band, which is and those people have been designing with the different using this showing that the circular structure shape is higher comparative superior than the other antenna structures, but their designs have been different array forms. So we have to find out that at certain 1.5 gigahertz, we couldn't find any simulations on this area. So we're using the methodology as for first step, we have to design a single patch antenna, which is of the three patch with three structures. That is, which is a rectangular, circular, and bow type, and which is all are working in the 1.5 gigahertz frequency. Later, we have to expand the single antenna into 2 into 2 array simulations. And at the final stage, we develop the optimization minimization procedure. These are the design parameters for we are using for the single patch antenna, right? We have to these parameters are calculated by the theoretical formulas, which is by the various references. And coming to the array structure, these are the array that 2 into 2 antenna array. So total 4 antenna elements we have to simulate it, and all of these are working in 1.5 gigahertz of antenna. And after simulation of this length, we have to observe that the patch width is depending upon the resonance frequency. So we have to require to finding an optimization procedure for the getting the patch width value. So because while simulation using the theoretical formula, we have to observe that it shows some variations from the design output. So for the optimization procedure, we first design the single patch antenna using the theoretically calculated patch width and patch length. After we have to simulate the antenna, and we will to find we will to observe that there is some difference in the resonant frequency. So we'll for making into an optimization table, we require a data table, and we choose by choosing the fixing the patch width at 35 millimeter and 130 millimeter. We are to dividing into five divisions of variations. After that, we will have to simulate this antenna, and we making a data set table which is consisting of the main lobe deviation from 90°, half power beamwidth, side lobe magnitude, back lobe magnitude, S11 magnitude, and the deviation from the desired frequency, that is a deviation from the 1.5 gigahertz. And coming, we are to making it out data steps into a polynomial fit function. For this concern, we are to making into a 10-degree polynomial function, and later it have into normalized this normalized expression, and we choose that is as the objective function and plot with the patch width values. on this current output we generator we using these 5 parameters. We give different weightages that for our requirement the half power beamwidth is requires the maximum importance, so we put the half power beamwidth at 50 weightage because it requires the more weightage, so as per our requirement we can change those weightage. And on plotting this y-axis as choosing the y-axis in the objective function and x-axis for the patch width antenna, we could observe that the around 57.8 millimeter as the patch width for the simulation. And under these weightages, that is, we can change these weightages as per our data table. Coming to the result analysis. These are the simulations of the radiation far field pattern for the each antenna element array as well as the array functions. These values will be explained at the result slides. These are the resonant frequency values observed in the rectangular, circular, and bow and tie antenna arrays. From these, we have to observe that's bow and tie antenna. Sir? From this, we have to obtain the bow and tie antenna having higher bandwidth values. And after completing this simulation, we will observing this. We will coming into this output table. From this, we are observing this, but a circular patch antenna is outperformed compared to the other parameters, while it is having the higher beam, lower the half power beam as well as higher the gain. So our objective for the function objective is to getting an antenna array structure which is having lower half power beamwidth, which have better gain because than the current systems. So we have to observe that the circular shape we will be choosing while those antenna array shaped into 2x2 patch antenna array, and that will be the performance. And coming to the optimization algorithm, while we the requirement of optimization algorithm is our objective is to reduce the half power beamwidth. So we choosing the half power beamwidth as y-axis, and x-axis we choose the width of patch antenna. We should we will observe that graph is growing directly proportional. So we have to increase we want to increase the patch parameter, then only we can get the lower half power beamwidth, so which is not practically possible. So
sorry for interrupt. Please, presenter, you have last 1 minute. Please conclude your presentation.
Yes, these are my conclusions. While observing these final tables, we're observing that circular patch antenna is having the higher directivity, higher gain, and lower half power beamwidth. While with the array structure, the bow and tie is having wider bandwidth. So we're getting in the conclusion that circular patch width is outperformed than the other two types, that is rectangular and bow and tie. And the future works at present we are including a rectangular patch antenna, so we have to increase into various shapes as well as fabricating into a real life experience, real life, and we can observe the parameters. And these are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit.
Yes,
to our session chair, any comments regarding presentation? And
Sarah, any comments or recommendations?
Yeah, Ajit, can you please tell me the software in which simulation has been carried out?
I have used the computer simulated software, CST.
Okay.
Yes, for optimization procedure, I have chosen the MATLAB.
There is one suggestion to all the presenters. While presenting, please go in your slideshow mode rather than just showing the slides, so that we can have a full view of the slide.
Yes.
Maybe sir can ask me. Prashant sir.
Yeah. Sir, can you, Ajit sir, can you go to the slide number maybe 10, 12, where you have the optimization data? Maybe slide number 8.
Sir.
Yeah, can you go? Yeah, thank you very much. Go to the slideshow and can you present fully?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's the optimization procedure.
Yeah. So, how you obtain the fit expression, polynomial fit expression?
that make a data table. So first we have to design the antenna as per the theoretical parameters. After that we have to observe some deviation from the desired design frequency. So for the optimization procedure, we need a certain data sets. So we choose this following parameters: that is main lobe deviation from 90°, upward beamwidth, side lobe and back lobe, S1 magnitude, those values. And we give the certain weightages. Like if you, our output is getting the half power beamwidth should be minimum, so we will get the maximum importance to the half power beamwidth weightage that gives the 40. At present state, we choose that 40. Similarly, for second important thing is the deviation from the designed frequency. That is also we choosing to get next weighted, that will reduce to 30, while we given the lowest value 5 and 5 for backlog. From that we will be able to make a data set for the table. Okay. And we fix that width of the patch is 35 to 130 millimeter. That is because less than 35 millimeter is observed that there is not that much variation that we have to observe. And beyond the 130 millimeter is not practical. That's commercially available size of PCB. We are facing certain issues for the practical implementation. Later, each data sets have been converted into a 10-degree polynomial function. Okay. That is a polyfit experimentation. Then convert this into a normalized polynomial function, because these all functions are in different units. So we need it into an uniform way or a unified way for our so we choose into an normalized polynomial section between the -1 and 1. So all values and between those values, and taking that value as our objective function. This objective function is the product of this normalized value and our weightage.
Okay, thank you, Ajit.
Yes.
So yes, so now I would like to invite our next presenter. It's Kat Kote.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be addressing you. I'm sorry I'm not present. It would be much better because I'm working in the area of Professor Fung was talking about in terms of setting up learning systems for teaching humanitarian engineering or things. So I'm talking about engineering in action in this, where we get our students to go out and do projects. And I'd be interested in talking to other people what teaching you do in the area of the sustainable development. And I'd like to first also acknowledge the Larrakia people of the Darwin area where I'm working now, up in Darwin. And I work with Engineers Without Borders who do projects in communities. And for this year, we're working in Australia because of difficulty traveling overseas. And we'll be working next year in Australia too with Aboriginal communities. So this is great. It's a chance to share our knowledge about sustainable methods that the Aboriginal people are using. So the idea is that the students are involved in very practical projects, learning the issues of sustainability and design thinking and working across cultures. So they're working with communities, and the communities learn about the technology as they work with the students, because the communities have been isolated from the technological developments for many years. So they haven't had the access to that opportunity to grow with the technology as it grows. So we teach a lot in terms of processes, such as around design thinking, sustainability in your design, participatory design, the process of working with the users of the final system, and the project management, of course, is part of the teaching. This is the actual design process that we developed for EWB, and we've enhanced this with Indigenous processes of how to think. The Indigenous people have various ideas of have ways of thinking. So there's the kinship mind, where you develop a relationship with people or knowledge. There's a storytelling where you empathize. So it's very clearly defined the sort of process we're using in learning at each stage of the project. And some of the tools we're using for the students is what collaboration between peers is report writing, setting up reviews, and sharing. So they share each other's work and mark each other's work, get some idea what other people are doing, but also they're working in teams. So there's a lot of collaboration there. We're trying to reuse the content provided in the sense making. So, so that, you did ask me, I meant to be on presentation. I'm very sorry. Yes, and so we're report writing in using content in terms of sense making is we're trying to look at how we collate resources to provide another approach across different subjects or across different years, and also looking at the level of view so that a student will be writing a report so they could look at a summary of what that part of the report should be about, and then they look at what they wrote and they might summarize what they wrote to try and get them to look at different levels of their own writing, so different levels of view. And also we have tutors and students interface to the content so that the tutors can have some guidance for the students. So this is all the sort of technology that we're developing for the teaching process. And we're developing simulations so that in a simulation you remove certain variables, like you might say to the students, when we were face-to-face, we'd say like put a blindfold on and then work out how they'd manage things in a team to see how the team developed. And also various abstract issues that we can deal with then is like the issue of team management, facilitation, all those sort of issues can come up in discussion when we reflect on these simulations. And finally, probably the most interesting area is the technology for teaching. We're working on ontologies because to develop the technology for teaching, you need to describe the teaching. And that's a lot around the sequencing of material and the assessment, so that the assessment links to the actual material presenting. As I described, a lot of the material presenting is around processes that students are doing. It's not particularly factual content, but still we need to give them a good coherent idea of what we expect them to go through and how they're going in those stages. So we're trying to develop authored tools so that tools that will provide these subjects and repeat them, but allow the lecturer to change them for particular student groups. So we have authoring tools that can do collaborative learning scenarios where we set up those scenarios using the ontology of the right teaching method that we consider the particular taxonomy that we're covering and relate it to the assessment. So the tools will support the teacher. So you need to be fairly expert to use the tools, but they do assist you in the teaching. And we can link these to microworlds and online labs. So it's very much an online space already, so it links easily into other existing technology in terms of learning. And probably the most recent move we've been doing is developing interface to this material. So it's great to have some idea of the content or the process, but the interface like React.js provides a template for sessions. So we can say, okay, we want to add another session. Here's the general template we're using, and make it just another React.js file, and then generate the particular class from those files. And also you might know of HP5, which is that's more like for sharing objects across subjects. So you might have an object in one subject you want to share to another, and creating an HP5 allows us to share it very easily across it. So that was a very, hopefully, quick summary of what I'm doing. And I'm interested in other people's work in this teaching and sustainability area, particularly with Indigenous groups around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, presenter. Session chair, any comments regarding presentation?
Yeah, thank you. How do you pronounce? I don't know, but thank you for your presentation. Have been through your research area on the website of University of Sydney. How do you understand the problem solving or project-based learning in Europe and your education? If I ask you, how do you compare, and what are the advantages that you see in engineering in action that you presented?
It's because it's a real problem, and you're dealing with people who are very different across different cultures, you give the students an opportunity to experience something and make mistakes in that space when it's not directly with the community. So in a sense, the community is still remote. There's a portal of FAQ to supply information and answer their questions, so they're not continually badgered by students, but also they don't have to deal with students' comments that aren't appropriate, but they do get the technology back. So something comes to them saying, this is technology based on what we understood you were talking about, and they learn from that experience of how to work with engineers. What's an engineer going to deliver, what sort of expression they need, and how to, so the general discussion. But because they're dealing with a mass of students, we keep that sort of interface through FAQs. So for the student, they have that real experience of working with someone whose aspirations are quite different. And at the end, they get basically judged by that, by the client group will say, look, that's a useful product, or that is way off. That's nothing like what we'd use or would be valid. And it is really quite an eye-opener for our students to understand someone else, their values and their needs. And yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you.
It's really enjoyable to teach. Yeah, thank you. I hope.
Yeah, hello. I have a question. What level of students are you basically catering to?
At the moment, that the Engineers Without Borders course was designed for first years, but now we've expanded because I've been working through all years. So what happens is the first year students will do a project and come out with some not highly technical object or design. And then through their years, they or another group can take up the projects that's been selected by the community. They'll say, look, we're interested in that. It might work. Here's the issues. So they'll take up and develop it. And in our honours year, we have quite a few students who do honours, and then they can go and see the community. They can actually talk to community and work with them directly. They're much more aware of the issues, much less offensive, and can do a better chance of making something that's useful. And so that's particularly where the participatory design aspect comes in, that it's much stronger because they're actually working with people and doing the workshops. And yeah.
That's it. You can go ahead, Richard.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next sessions.
Now I would like to invite our next presenter. This is Ms. Arokia Priya.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Just a minute. Good afternoon, dignitaries and my peer participants. My name is Arokia Priya Charles. I'm the author of this particular paper, and the co-author is Dr. Mrs. Levipan. The title of the paper is Depth Estimation Using Blob Detection for Stereo Vision Images. And my paper ID is 211. I'm going to go through the presentation in this following manner. I'll go with an introduction, literature survey, the motivation, the methodology, the results, the conclusion, and the references. To start with, let me introduce what exactly I'm talking about, what exactly could be depth. So depth is something which actually is the distance of a particular object which is away from the camera. Here, stereo vision simply means that I'm going to make use of two cameras which are set apart with a distance of 50 mm. Why 50 mm is the eye happens to be, on an average for every human being, the eye happens to be separated 50 millimeter apart. Hence, we are going to use two cameras which are 50 meter away with each other, and we are going to detect an object which is away from the camera at a particular depth. So we are going to estimate the distance of the object which is away from the camera, that we call it as a depth estimation using stereo images. Now let me introduce what is the disparity here, because quite often I'll be using the term disparity. Disparity is inversely proportional to depth. Disparity here simply means like when you are looking at a picture through your eyes, when you close one of the eye, the object that you are looking is visible at a particular distance which is more towards the left, and when you close down the right eye and look through the left eye, the same object is actually located more towards your right. So this kind of a separation or the distance that is maintained between the object when you are looking through the eye is what is exactly called as a disparity. And based on the disparity of those two images is what we are trying to calculate as a depth. And usually depth is inversely proportional to disparity. And this kind of a thing is majorly applicable in several areas which I have listed, like for example, medical, robotics, 3D videos, self-driving cars and whatnot. So this area it has a wider field of application, I would say. Now, there are several methods that are available to compute the depth. We call it as an active method, wherein these are the cameras that are available in order to estimate the depth directly. The second method is passive method, wherein we apply algorithms. We don't use the depth vision cameras. Instead, we go ahead with applying an algorithm in order to calculate the depth by using certain things. In my case, I'm using disparity. And out of which the provisions are, we can again go ahead with a single camera. We can go ahead with two cameras, which we call it as a stereo vision and multi-view. And I'm going ahead with the second option, which is a stereo vision camera in order to compute the depth of a scene. Now, I said no for active methods because I want to apply my own algorithm. Hence, I said no. And why I went for a stereo camera, because it's easy to implement. Single camera actually involves a complex geometric calculation is what I have gone through the papers I came to know. And multi-camera becomes a costly affair for me because I need to have multiple cameras which has the same specification, I would say, which is going to be difficult practically. And hence, I landed up in going ahead with a stereo camera. So these are the, as I said, I'm going ahead with the passive method and the stereo vision. And these are the possible methods that are already available with this. One is called as the local method. Another one is the global method. The local method is otherwise called area based or a window based, and global method is an energy based. So a global method, if you look at, it is very time consuming, but it is accurate. And because it is time consuming, for a real time application, because we want things instantly, like, so I just kept going ahead with the global method and then started focusing on a local method, which is actually an area based. Over here, the trade-off is accuracy versus speed. Accuracy is not that much when compared to a global method, but yes, speed wise, it's going to give a very good result for me. Hence, I went through the local methods. And with respect to these problems also, like in case of a local method, when I talk about an area, so image can be of a huge size, and I'm going to divide that image to windows, particular windows. So choosing a window again is a problem. Smaller the window, the lesser is the accuracy. Larger the window, more is the accuracy. And again, it's going to be vice versa when the size of the object is going to be small or small. So that is the problem which I have faced with a window-based method also. So hence I got the motivation of getting into or proposing an accurate depth estimation technique, and which actually complies of the computational complexity also, which can suit the real-time applications. So I thought of giving more attention to computational complexity. So I have focused on the following three problems, which I have listed here in this particular slide. The first one is the minimizing the time complexity by proposing the multi-core concept for real-time environments. So I have tried using the general GPUs here. And second point is developing an accurate depth value of objects with minimum pre-processing steps. So for whatever paper I have referred to, people have gone into the method of rectification and calibrating the cameras. I have tried to avoid those by implementing a blob detection here. And the third point is all about developing a simple algorithm which can be used in handheld devices. So what I thought was it should not be used only in laptops, it can even be implemented in more handheld devices like mobile. So I just have chosen the software based on that. So this is the motivation, and I have referred to so many papers wherein people have worked with images, people have worked with the videos, they have implemented machine learning algorithms, they have implemented the sum of squared techniques, which we call as parametric. They have even implemented non-parametric, which is otherwise the census transforms, rank transforms and census transforms. So I've gone through certain papers on this, and then I came up with the methodology, and this is the block diagram of my methodology. I can divide this as two different things. One is I tried using with the background and without the background. In case of background, I
Priya,
used
you
to,
have only 1 minute. Please
oh
conclude
my,
your presentation.
okay, I'll just go through. So I have subtracted the image, and then I have applied the thresholding technique to it, so that the foreground and background are separated, and then I went ahead with the blob detection, and then I tried to find the center of gravity, and hence I came up. So this is the background subtraction algorithm, wherein I just go for a subtraction of the left and right images, and this is the thresholding part for me to separate the foreground from the background, and this is the blob detection technique I have applied. The blob detection simply means I trace out an object by identifying only the black or the white pixels, and then take out the center of gravity from both the images. This is the output of single and multiple object blobs that I have detected. After detecting blobs from both the images, I take out the center of the gravity, I subtract them, and then I find out the pixel. So this is the overall depth calculation I'm trying to use, which actually is, if you see, it is a triangulation method. Since there is a lack of time, I'm not explaining into that, but this is the triangulation method which we have tried to use in order to calculate the depth. So as I said, it is nothing but using the focal length of the camera. X1 minus X2 is the disparity of the stereo vision images, and they have calculated the depth of the image. And then, so hence I'm going into the multi-threading process. I'm using Java, so hence it helps in multi-threading. I started using GPU, wherein I can apply the algorithm to multiple cores. Hence, I said, as I mentioned in my motivation, like one of the aim for me is to reduce the computational complexity, and hence I could achieve the computational complexity using it. And these are the results for me. Like I have taken several images. The first column talks about the actual depth, that is a 43 centimeter. I kept an object, and with the baseline separation of the camera of 50 centimeter, I'm getting a depth measurement at actual of 46.4 centimeter, and this is the flow. So I've taken the measurement right from 43 centimeter to 103 centimeter, and my error is less. But if the baseline, if the separation between the cameras are increasing, the error goes increasing. So as just because our eyes are only 50 millimeters apart, I guess this particular concept goes very well by giving a very minimum error, is what I feel. So these are some screenshots of what I have taken with different depth of the objects, and I have got almost closer at actual the depth with the measurement. So these are the plots from for the baseline of 50 millimeter and 75 millimeter, wherein I have even plotted the error of them for the same. And the conclusion is I could achieve the lesser computation time compared to any other papers that I have referred to, and it worked for me very well. If the resolution of the camera is more, maybe I can increase the depth also more, is what I conclude with out of the whole thing. And these are my references. And thank you so much. Waiting for the questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. Yes, I have two questions.
Yes, sir.
The first question is, what is the rationale of your work, number one? And number two is your work has implemented for the objects which are overlapping? Because whatever the results you have shown,
yes, sir,
it shows that the objects are distinct.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
exactly.
So
yeah.
I hope you received my question.
Yes, sir.
So your answer, please.
Sir, I didn't get your first question. Will you please repeat the first question?
What is the rationale of your work? I mean, if you are trying to justify the benefits of your work, I will be very happy to hear you.
Yeah,
I mean to say, yeah, please go ahead.
So if I'm not wrong, you mean to say like, have I implemented it anywhere?
He's saying, why have you, what is the benefit of doing this particular thing? Why did you come upon this project?
Why did you come? Yes, sir. Sir, it is like, so for all the robotic applications, if we can fix two cameras in order to identify an object wherein the humans cannot reach a particular place. So in such cases, for the security reasons, if there is humans are not present, or if an object is detected which we are more bothered about, and such things can be detected with this in kind of robotic applications. And these kind of things are even applicable for robotic kind of a surgery. These papers I have come across wherein doctors are using stereo vision cameras in order to find the depth of their bone to go for an operation remotely. So keeping these in mind, I thought maybe we can come across such a thing in order to find the distance of a particular object through the camera itself. That was the main aim of going ahead with this kind of a project, sir. And the second question is, yes, rightly you mentioned that this blob detection is not going to work when there is an overlap of images, because it's going to overlap and then identify as a single blob. So as long as the images are separate, this is going to work very perfectly. And for the overlapping images, I have done another part also, wherein I have applied a machine learning in order to detect the object, and then I go ahead with the rest of the project instead of the blob detection. So blob detection, I have just modified, or I would say I have just canceled blob detection, and I went ahead with the machine learning if there are overlapping of an, but the rest of the procedure remains the same, sir. Finding out the center of gravity, and I have applied that also, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
There's one more thing.
Yes, ma'am.
Like you have also developed the algorithm yourself for clearing the background. You're using some predefined algorithm.
Now this particular thing is a very simple background subtraction I have done, ma'am. I have just subtracted the foreground. I mean, I just took one blank image, and then I kept an object, and then I tried to do the subtraction part. But if I'm going ahead with the better subtraction algorithms, the output may further improve. This is to start
you can
with.
try that maybe.
Yes, sure.
The complexity might decrease more.
Decrease. Yeah, sure, ma'am. I'll take up your suggestion.
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Priya. Now I would like to invite our next presenter, Tanuja Patil. Hello.
Hello.
Yes,
Am I
Tanuja.
audible?
Yes, Tanuja, you are audible.
Okay.
Please start your presentation.
Yes. Is the screen visible, ma'am?
No, Tanuja, your screen is not visible.
Okay. Hello. Is it visible now?
No. Please share your screen on your screen tab.
1 second. Hello. Is
Hello?
it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay.
Please start your presentation.
Hello. Okay. Good afternoon, all. So I take this opportunity to present my paper, that is Pixel Count Approach for Lossy Image Compression, and my paper ID is 272. And authors are myself, Tanuja Patil. I am working as Associate Professor in the School of Electronics and Communication, KLE Technological University, Hubli. And my co-author is Vishnath P. Badigar. He is also Professor in School of Computer Science, KLE Technological University, Hubli. Okay, contents being introduction, motivation, proposed methodology, compression phase, decompression phase, results and conclusion, and references. Okay, so why do we need image compression? So as we all know, nowadays images constitute a major part of the data being stored and communicated. They consume a lot of space because of their larger file size. And grayscale images such as photographs, internet for visual display are stored with 8 bits per sampled pixel. Hence, it is required to reduce the size of an image file for its efficient storage and transmission. And this is possible because of some redundancy existing in the images in the form of coding redundancy, interpixel redundancy, and psychovisual redundancy. And this coding redundancy, it is in the form of number of bits used to represent a pixel. And we can use variable length coding, which can be used by using less number of bits for more probable pixels and more bits for less probable bits. And so on, we can reduce the interpixel redundancy and psychovisual redundancy also. Okay, and while doing so, while removing the redundancy, it will result into two types of image compression. One is lossless and another is lossy. So if we compare these two, Lossless image compression is required in the applications like medical images, satellite imagery, etc., wherein the reconstruction of the image should be perfect. It means each and every detail should be retained. And here compression ratio becomes lesser because we have to reconstruct each and every detail. And the compression techniques used here are Hoffman coding, arithmetic coding, LZW coding, run length coding, etc. But in the lossy image compression, the applications are like GIS, multimedia data, wherein compression ratio should be higher with a slight loss in information. So the compression technique used here are various transform coding, DCT, wavelet transform, etc. But why we have chosen this one? What is the motivation for us? That is JPEG. We know JPEG offers both lossy and lossless compression, and it is chosen as a standard. But it offers very high compression ratio in case of lossy compression, but the quality of the decompressed image is low. Also, JPEG images at very low quality suffer from blocking effects called artifacts, as shown here. In the low quality images, when they are saved with some lossy image compression technique, so at that time it will result into such artifacts which are not required. So, and it's computation intensive. Hence, we are proposing a new algorithm which offers high quality image at low PSNR values and is less computation intensive. So let us see what is this proposed methodology. So ours is pixel count approach using thresholding. So here raw images are scanned in raster scan manner, and number of pixels is computed whose sum is lesser than a threshold, and this number is stored in a file instead of storing each pixel intensity value. Later reconstruction is done by calculating the average of this count in a unique way, and each pixel value is thus reconstructed. So now we'll go into detail like how the compression algorithm works. The steps involved are, we have chosen grayscale images of size 512 by 512 for image compression, and this image is scanned in raster scan manner, and the pixel intensity values, that is f of xy, are added till the sum is lesser than the threshold. Threshold is chosen as 255. Why? Because this is the maximum intensity value in grayscale images. So sum is computed using the equation, that is sum is equal to f of xy, that is the present pixel, plus next pixel f of xy plus 1, and again next pixel, and so on till the sum is lesser than or equal to 255. And if the sum exceeds 255, count is stopped, and this count is saved in a file called as count file. And next is we are calculating the difference, that is difference is equal to 255 minus sum. This difference is saved in another file called difference file. So the original image is compressed into two files, that is count file and difference file. Later these two files are Hoffman encoded for further compression. And this is how our research work looks like. We have the original image here, and it is going to generate two output files, that is count file and difference file. Now coming to the decompression phase, how the decompression algorithm works, and this is very simple. So decompression algorithm has the following steps, that is read the count file and difference file created during the compression phase. Then Hoffman decode the files because already we have encoded using Hoffman. Then reconstruction is done using the equation average is equal to 255 minus difference divided by the count, and reconstruct count number of pixels using this average value. So this is the same thing. I'll explain with an example. So this is a one sample Lina image of 512 by 512 size. Only one sample of 6 by 3 we have taken. So initial pixel intensity values are 106, 110, 108, and so on. So for this, we'll see how the calculation of count values is done. So as I told, image is scanned in raster scan manner, and pixel intensity values are added as shown till the sum is lesser than the threshold, that is 255. So consider the sample Lina image shown in figure 1. So here sum is 106 plus 110 is 216. As we can see here, 106 plus 110. I'm going to add consecutive pixels. Now 260 is lesser than 255, hence the next pixel value is also added, that is 108. So when I add this, so it will result into 324. Now 324 is greater than 255, hence count is stopped and the count is 2. Similarly, count is calculated for the next pixels, and these count values are stored in count file as shown in figure 2. So here we can see like how this 6 by 3 pixel values have reduced into 3 by 3 values. This is one calculation of count. So next is calculation of difference values. How the difference is calculated? Difference is equal to 255 minus sum. So the sum in the previous case is 216. As you can see here, this is the sum. So 255 minus sum, that will result into 39. So now 39 is saved in the difference file as shown in figure 3. Similarly, other differences are calculated. So this is our figure 3 wherein the values like 39, 36, 35, these are saved. So this is how we have.
Tanuja, you have last 1 minute. Please conclude your presentation.
Okay. So this is how I calculated count and difference. So now we are measuring the quality of the reconstructed image using the compression ratio. So here the count and difference files are further Huffman encoded. File size of count is around 5 KB and difference file is around 100 KB. Original file size is 257 KB. So compression ratio will calculate using this equation: original image size divided by compressed, that is 257 by 105, it is 2.4. So better compression ratio is achieved for darker and more uniform images. And we are proposing another metric here. Usually the images are measured with the peak signal to noise ratio. So this all of us know. So let us go to our metric, which is the new one that we are proposing as correctness ratio. So what do you mean by this correctness ratio? Here it is number of pixels same as that of original divided by the total number of pixels in the image. So the following results show the correctness ratio. So here this is the original Lina image and this is the reconstructed image. Here we can see almost the quality of the image is same as the original. And these are some other images which we have tried. And coming to the comparative analysis, proposed algorithm is compared with JPEG glossy, and results obtained reveal that the quality of the decompressed image obtained by the proposed is better than that of the JPEG glossy at same PSNR value. So we'll show this in the next two tables. That is, here are the input files which we have tried, that is Lina, Baboon, Barbara, etc. For this, the PSNR is 34 and the total number of pixels in the original image is 2,62,144, and the correct pixel count if we use JPEG approach is 34,454, but correct pixel count using proposed approach is 84,229. So here we can see drastically the correctness ratio has correct pixels have improved, and similarly for Baboon also it is improved, and for Barbara also it is improved. In this way the correct pixels have improved. And in next I'll show the comparison of correctness ratio. Again the same images, but what is the increased number of pixels, that is 49,775 in case of Lina image. And if we use JPEG approach, correctness ratio is 0.18. But if we use our approach, it is 0.32. Similarly, for other images, you can see the correctness ratio has drastically improved. So the conclusion is the proposed compression methodology offers high fidelity decompressed image at low PSNR values. The algorithm yields a compression ratio of 2 and is simple and less computation intensive. The quality achieved during decompression by the proposed algorithm is better than the quality achieved by JPEG glossy. This we want to say here. And this we can measure with our new metric called correctness ratio, as this metric gives one more approach to measure the number of pixels in the decompressed image, which exactly match with the pixels in the original image. And the ratio is improved by this proposed algorithm. And these are my references. Okay, thank you. So if any questions.
Thank you, Madam Tanuja. Can you go back to your algorithm where you have a calculation of f of x squared and f of x squared plus 1?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Yeah, that's the point. If the sum x is 255, the count is top.
Yes.
Right. And what about the other pixels after, say, that count means to 255?
Okay, so so in this example, sir, with the help of this example, I will explain. That is 106 plus 110, 216. So 216 plus 108, that will give us 324. Now 324 greater than 250, hence count is stopped at 2. Means these two pixels will consider, and we'll say the count as 2. And this pixel is counted in the next one, in the next run. Yes. So in the next run, again this 108 plus the next pixel.
Next
that
pixel will come.
Yes, yes. So nothing is lost here.
Okay,
yes,
and how many, for an image of 255, that's the size you took, how many count will be there? Like count 1, 2, 3, 4?
I didn't get.
So you have image where we have different pixel values. As
Yes.
the count goes close to 255.
No, sir.
Then,
Actually, the grayscale image is saved in the range of 0 to 255, the pixel intensity values. That means 0 is for black, exactly black, and 255 for white. So we
yeah.
have 0 to 255, so many variations. No, so that is the grayscale maximum intensity value threshold we have chosen as 255. But the count can be like it can be 2, it can be 3, or it can be 4. Like depends on the pixel intensity value of the consecutive pixels. So suppose some pixels are having the intensity values like 20, 45, 65. So at that time, count value may increase. Like it may come around a 5, 6. So at that time, more compression ratio we can achieve. But if the intensity value is more like 106, 160, so at that time, count value may be 1 or it may be 2. So in that way. So instead of storing each and every pixel intensity values, we are saving only the count value and also the difference value. Yes.
So in a count, you can have more than one pixel value, no doubt.
Yes,
maybe it can be 3, it can be 4, and that 4, 5 values we are representing by one value.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And here it will result into slight loss because we are replacing the, in the reconstruction, we are replacing with the average value. But this we are measuring with the help of correctness ratio, wherein we have seen like there is a drastic improvement as compared to JPEG glossy. That's our conclusion actually.
Okay. Maybe space complexity will be an issue because you are taking additional values and additional files. Maybe that will lead to an additional complexity.
No, sir. Actually, count and difference files, they are taking 105 KB. Compared to the original file size, it is taking 257 KB. So compression ratio is also higher.
Okay.
But compared to JPEG glossy, compression ratio is lesser. That I agree. Why? Because while reducing to have the more compression ratio, the loss is more in the case of JPEG glossy. But wherein ours is compression ratio is slightly lesser than the JPEG, but quality has been improved.
And what is your result in terms of number of images that you have considered? How many images you consider?
I have taken 6 here.
6?
Yes.
Okay.
So in general, in your experimentation, how many images have you tried?
Around 10 to 12 I have taken, ma'am. But here only 6 we have represented on the paper.
One more thing, you are only working on black and white grayscale images?
Only on grayscale image. No, we are not working on color images.
Maybe you can convert a color image into grayscale and then you can try your experiment.
Yes.
Have you tried that?
Yes.
Because converting grayscale color image into grayscale, many algorithms are available. So you can take those algorithms as it is, maybe, and you can try.
Yes, sir. Both we have tried, like grayscale image and converting the color to gray. We have worked on this and we are getting the same results.
Okay. Right. Photo on Bomla.
Thank you.
One more thing. I would like to go to your correctness ratio slide.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, how is it different from peak signal to noise ratio?
Okay.
Can you please compare the two?
Yes. In peak signal to noise ratio, we are taking the original minus reconstructed image square and we are summing it and dividing by the total number of pixels. But here we are not taking the square, only original minus the reconstructed value. So here that difference, if it is 0, that means it is exactly reconstructed value is exactly same as original. But here what happens in PSNR, since we are taking the square, so if the difference is 1 or 2 more also, it will give the result as the same PSNR. Means same PSNR for JPEG, suppose for Lina image it is 34 PSNR, and using our algorithm also 34. But for the same PSNR values, the correct pixels in a JPEG is lesser compared to this one, because ours is only original minus the reconstructed pixel value. But here they are taking the square. That is original minus reconstructed square. So while taking square, so it will eliminate some of the errors what are going to exist. Means they are highlighted actually. So same PSNR it will show, but the correct pixels are not so much in JPEG. But here correct pixels are more with our approach. Okay, ma'am?
Thank you, Tanuja, for your presentation.
Okay.
I would like to invite our next presenter, Saif Ali Atib.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start the sharing screen now.
Let's please start the presentation.
Yes. Is it visible now?
Yes, it's visible.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to present the paper, which is feature selection optimization using a hybrid genetic algorithm. So the paper ID is 358, and here you can see the authors and co-authors. So first of all, let me ask you a question. Who is this? Anyone has any idea? Anyone can reply.
Maybe we are seeing first time.
Yes.
Everyone is mute, so no one
Okay.
is.
Okay. Okay. So basically, this is Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, as you know, he's proposed the theory of survival of the fittest, and you must be thinking he's from the biological field. So how is he related to computer science? Since feature selection is all about machine learning and all. So in this project, instead of selecting individuals or species, we'll be simply selecting the features, that is columns of a data set, which are most likely to result in a better model, that is better accuracy of the model. So our whole algorithm is inspired by Mr. Charles Darwin. So why feature selection? In today's world, we know for any algorithm to run, we require data. Data is the fuel, right? But raw data, it is unsuitable for direct feeding into the model. So traditionally, actually, an algorithm itself must do the feature selection to get the best feature subset. But the problem is we require a very large data set that can go up to petabytes. There are some places where petabytes of data sets are present, but it's not so practical, right? So let me give you some examples of some bad features. For example, noise or outliers. Like these are some outbound values which have no meaning, and it could be any error or something which might have caused this. And there are some features which are low or negligible variance. For example, you are predicting if somebody is going to get diabetes by the age of 50, and you take everybody's weight. Suppose everybody in that column, everyone has a weight of 150 kgs. So the model is going to predict everyone's going to get type 2 diabetes. So in this way, we should try to avoid such features. These might be errors, right, by whoever is entering them or capturing them. Also, there might be some empty features. Like, for example, a column is present, but it has no values for each row. The whole thing is empty. It's just taking up your data. So we have to discard such features and not use it to predict our Y value in our model. And the last thing is the biased or single value features. For example, you have a binary feature like yes or no, and suppose every value is yes. So it doesn't make sense, right, keeping such features into our data set. Let me move on next. So our proposed solution is to firstly, we'll benchmark our model using logistic regression or linear regression to get some base accuracy. So we should know like what level are we expecting. And then next, what we have done is we combine our genetic algorithm with other machine learning models to get the best accuracy possible. So after running around 100 generations, we intend to get around 85 plus accuracy, which is pretty good. Next, let me just tell you what a genetic algorithm is. So it is just a basic search heuristic technique, right? For example, like for a data set which has n features, there are 2 to the power n data set subsets. So that's a huge amount, and that's a lot of computation. So instead of that, we're going to use genetic algorithm. So this is just reflecting the process of natural selection, that is survival of the fittest. So here is the basic pseudocode. So first we'll be generating the initial population. Let me just show you the diagram. See, this is the diagram. Over here in the first, as you can see, we are going, suppose we have 10 features. We're going to assume we use all 10 features to predict our Y value. So over here, all are ones. We have to try to reduce this to at least 5 or 6 features, right? That would be a pretty good value. Next, we're going to put it into our generation pool. So what we're going to do, we are going to initialize each individual, that is the feature. Suppose over here in the first vector, you can see this first feature is included, second feature is not included, third feature is included, and like that, you get the idea. So this is the first generation. So after initializing the first generation, what we do is we try to get the accuracy of each model. So the model will run with these features, this subset, then a model will run with this subset. So then we get the 2 accuracy values. I'm just taking a general sense. Usually we'll take around 50 to 100 features. That would be a pretty good value. And then what we're going to do, we're going to perform the fitness function. The fitness function is basically over here, it is just our accuracy value. So if the accuracy is more, the individual has more fitness, we're going to give more importance to this subset. Suppose this one has 85, 85 accuracy. So we're going to use this. Suppose this one has 60, we're going to discard this. Suppose there was another parent, that one has 86. So what we're going to do, we're going to use the 86 and the 85, and we're going to produce a child. So that's where crossover comes in. Crossover is the crossover of like reproduction, basically. Yeah, simply reproduction. You take 2 subsets and then you cross over, you get a new individual, and then you mutate. So over here, we're going to use a single point crossover. In the single point crossover, suppose we take this point, that is after the second one. So the first 2, 0 and 1, will come here, and this 0 and this 1 will come from here to this. So this brings us the first child. Similarly, we can do the second child. Suppose this 1 and 1 from here comes here, and this 0 and 1 comes from the first parent. This comes here. So now we have 2 children. And now, as you know, children are not same as their parents, right? So we need to perform some
You have only 1 minute. Please conclude your presentation.
Okay, yes. So we're going to perform the mutation operation. So the mutation will just, suppose we'll just flip one of the bit to change the value. So in this way, what we'll do, we'll come down generation by generation, and we'll finally try to get the best feature subset. After getting the best feature subset, we'll think whether we have to converge it or not. If we have to converge, that's it, we're going to stop, or we're going to repeat the process all over. So over here, we have used the SVM machine learning algorithm, which introduces a hyperplane to form 2 clusters and differentiate between them. So the conclusion is this is a primitive concept, and we need more practical implementation to validate this theory. However, this method is best applicable when a person who is implementing this machine learning model, he doesn't have the appropriate domain knowledge. So what we can do is he can just use this methodology, he can drop some unwanted features. Then if accuracy is not enough, he can bring up a domain expert, and obviously the domain expert knows which feature is best for this, and then we can hit that 90 plus accuracy level. That's it. I'm done.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Can you go to your conclusion slide once again?
Okay, just a second. Yes.
In the slide itself, you are saying, since this is a primitive concept, more
Yes.
practical, which is a primitive concept?
Yes.
In your view, which is a primitive concept? Can you please?
I mean to say this is a primitive concept that is initially in machine learning. What we do is we just have the data, we just have the model, we just do some feature engineering using regularization and other stuff, and then we just apply it to our model and try to get the accuracy. Over here, what we're doing, we're taking the features, we're trying to decide which feature is best for predicting our Y value. So that is a primitive concept. Like that has not much been done in the industry.
I think the presentation of conclusion is not proper. You should have written it. You should have
Okay.
refined it properly, because it is not being clear out here. कि what you are saying is a primitive concept and what you are doing is second. So you should have named it. Secondly, what is your termination condition for
Okay.
the genetic algorithm?
So the termination condition, we have around 100 generations. So when we reach the 100 generation, we just stop it.
It will always be 100 generations, or there is some fitness function on the basis of which we can terminate.
There are two ways to do it. Either we can have a fitness function to determine like, okay, so we have reached 91%. Is that enough? Okay, that's enough. We're going to stop. Or otherwise,
Can you
what we
please
can
show
do.
me your fitness function?
So our fitness function is basically just our accuracy value. Whatever accuracy we are getting, so that will be our fitness. That will be our fitness value.
So how are
What
you
I've done
calculating
here,
this fitness?
the fitness we are doing using the validation accuracy. The accuracy of the model, whatever you get, that is going to be our fitness function
So
value. That's it.
there has to be some formula for calculation. What is the formula? How do you
So,
calculate the accuracy?
so obviously we'll perform the validation data set. Then on the test data set, we'll calculate the fitness. And using the set scikit-learn packages and TensorFlow, we have many functions. So we can use those
You cannot
functions to
use any
determine.
function randomly for calculating fitness. You ought to have a fitness function which is suitable to your example, isn't it?
In our example, we have just used function from the packages, ma'am.
Of course, you have to use it from packages. But how does the fitness function suit your application? Can you please justify that?
So as I said, we'll take the individuals and then we'll try to we have a loop and then we'll try to calculate which of them has a better one. So based on that, we'll choose the parents and then we'll take the next child.
Should be clear. How will you decide upon the better? Which is better? What that is dependent on fitness function, isn't it?
Yes, that's just ranking of the individuals, ma'am. The one which has a high rank, that will be that will go on top.
My suggestion is, let's leave the discussion out here. You are not clear about the fitness function that you have to use, so you have to study more and check out more on your fitness function before applying it, because you yourself are not convinced about what you are using, right?
Traditionally, actually, ma'am, traditionally when we use the fitness function, it is we have some functions. I understand what you're saying, but over here, what we're doing is our validation accuracy is that is only the value, ma'am. We're directly using that value.
Oh, but can, because genetic algorithm majorly depends upon success depends upon your fitness function, right?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
And what is your mutation probability?
What is that?
Mutation probability.
Mutation probability.
Are you applying mutation or you're not?
Yes, ma'am. We have done mutation using, there's a deep package in Python, so we have implemented using that, ma'am. So
I'm
over
not
here
going
we'll
on
just
the software level right now. Look, software is one thing. Software is just the implementation part. But the concept has to be clear why you are applying it and what value you are giving it, right? That's it now. Sir
Yeah,
will
the
continue.
mutation is just to get our like a randomized value, because each children is not same as the parent, so we need to have some randomability.
That is fine. That is the concept of mutation that you are explaining. But why you have used it, at what value you have used it, you should be clear about those values.
Yes, ma'am.
That is it. Prashant, sir, over to you.
Yeah, ma'am. Certainly, thank you for your presentation. Just in a simpler way, can you tell me how the features are stored?
Yes.
How the features are stored? Basic question.
So the features are just it's just a base. It's a data set which has features. Then after that we'll have vectors. So each vector will have, like suppose over here we have 10. So we'll have an array of 10. So after that we'll just have many. For each individual we'll have a single array.
So which feature extraction technique you use?
I'm sorry.
Can you name the feature extraction method that you use?
Over here it is binary encoding, sir. One hot encoding for the categorical features and numeric for numeric features.
And what is the way to select the individual from the population?
The initial phase, the initialization is just we'll have some 50 individuals and they are randomly given. And then using linear regression, we're going to get some basic accuracy. And then over there we get the rankings, sir. We'll get the rankings like which has the best accuracy. So the child will be selected based on the best two individuals. We can have 2 children for each, so it can be the same number. It can continue on. We can have 50 generation 1, 50 generation 2, 50 generation 3, so on.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
Okay, sir.
So now I would like to invite, before inviting our next presenter, I mention one thing. There's a 8 minute for presentation and 2 minutes for question answer. Actually, we have so limited time, so we have to conclude in as soon as. So our next presenter is Jitendra Kumar.
Yeah, good afternoon. I am just sharing my slide. Just a moment. Is it visible?
Yes. Yes.
Should I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, all. So my presentation title is Quantification Multimillion Offers in Next of Kin Unsolicited Bulk Emails, and this paper has been authored by myself as well as Dr. Sachin Nayak, and I will be presenting this paper. The agenda of discussion is I will be talking about a little bit of introduction, literature review, and calculation of, in fact, various calculations. That is the core of this paper, and the identification of most commonly used first name and surname in UBE, And UBE basically means unsolicited bulk email, and commonly it is known as spam email or bulk email or junk email. Technically, it is called UBE for unsolicited bulk email or unsolicited email, simply unsolicited email. In fact, it is also called unsolicited commercial email, which is abbreviated as UCE sometimes. Okay, then I will be talking about identification of some atomic information pieces solicited by these scammers. And in fact, there is an interplay as far as this word scammers is concerned. I will be talking about scammers, spammers as well. And finally, I will conclude my presentation with the conclusions and references. So as I was just talking about unsolicited bulk emails, they are basically spam emails. And spam emails have many categories. So to be very much specific, we have emails. Emails have two main types, spam emails and non-spam emails. Ideally, we expect that non-spam emails should land in our inbox and spam emails should go in our spam box. So for all those mails which are going in the spam box, all of them are not of the same type. And one of the types that we have is next of kin spam emails or next of kin UBE. So I rather we created a corpus of more than 1500 of next of kin type of spam emails only. So you can just imagine, see, if you have to create a corpus of just spam emails, it is easy. But if you have to create a corpus of a particular type of spam emails, then it becomes a bit demanding. But we were able to create a corpus of approximately 1500 of them. And this research work is useful for designing hybrid filters with keywords. And in addition to the filters which already use artificial intelligence, we can use the statistics that I will be providing here. And obviously for identifying whether an email is of the specific type of the type of next of kin that we are interested in, we had to do some manual curation also. And C and Java programming were used for the implementation purposes. Now, as far as literature review is concerned, in fact, this one slide will not suffice, but given the shortage of time, I will not be able to go in depth as far as the literature review is concerned. I would like to focus on what we have done. But just to give you a glimpse, as far as the area of spam emails is concerned, most of the research works, in fact, there are any number of research works which have focused on, that binary classification problem of classifying whether, of identifying whether a given mail is a spam email or non-spam email. But when it comes to spam emails, there are only little number of works that have been done. For example, whether the attachment is there or which word has been used for maximum time, which is the month when maximum spam emails are sent, and the identification of non-dictionary words. Because then it becomes difficult for the text-based filters to identify whether an email is spam or not. Typically, these spammers use the concept of word salad. So instead of cucumber and tomato here, what they will do is they will create a salad, but they will create this salad of words. So they will intentionally put those words which actually should be found in the genuine email and make sure that this way they are bypassing the spam filters. And the spam mail actually lands in their it lands in the inbox of the victims. Okay, so some research works have also been done for correlation between the spam emails and IP addresses, and then the viruses and spam emails, and so on. So as far as Twitter and spam emails is concerned, people have also worked on analysis of phone numbers in spam emails. And in fact, there are many research works which talk about the use of social engineering for spam emails, and there is spear phishing based attacks. Am I audible? Can anyone confirm?
Yes, you are audible, Jitin.
Okay, fine, thank you. Okay, then as of February 2020, I found one research work, which is latest in fact, which said that victims have lost $3,291 US. So this is in millions, and they have also identified that 60% of the victims were females, and the age group was 45 to 64 years. So now if we take the combination of all of these factors, we can say that females who are in the age group of 45 to 64 years are more prone to these type of attacks. I will say that these are basically attacks only, because spammers don't spam just for the sake of it. They are spending their energy, money, and effort behind it, and they want people to get victimized. And the bait, specifically the bait that they use for next of kin type of emails, are the issues like I am a relative of someone and someone has died, I am alone in this world, I want to invest some money in your country and you should help me. And then they will typically say that we want to transfer some 100, 200 or whatever millions of US dollars or pounds in your country, and we will transfer it to your account. So the person will get victimized, and then they will say that, okay, you give us this much money, then only we will initiate this transaction. And actually people have people fall victim to these type of cases, and they lose their money. And out of embarrassment, from point of view of society.
Jiten, please conclude your presentation. You have last 2 minutes.
Oh my God. Okay, fine. So I will just skip the literature review. I found that spammers use dollars and euros, and the average amount that I found was 10.64 million USD. That they are, if you just see the title of this slide, calculation of offered average transaction amount as the compensation that they will be giving to the victim. So something that they are using as a bait. So this is just a snapshot of 1562 emails that I have used, and the transaction amount, the total amount, the currency, and the offered share, and the transaction completion days. Actually, there are very few mails we talk about this transaction completion duration. Next is calculation of average share of offered compensation. So highest I found was 50%, lowest was 30%, most common shared offer was 40%, and only 5.5% of UBE contain this value, and this is the actual date. Because people get attracted to this amount, that I will be getting this much money, so let me proceed with this transaction. As far as calculation of average transaction time, as I mentioned that there are only a few emails, so there are only 2.49% UBE which contain this value. Average was 9 days, maximum was 14 days, and the minimum I found was 3 days. And it was mentioned in terms of hours, it was 72 hours. Calculation of average total amounts mentioned in the UBE, only 1.86% UBE contained this value, and the average was 134 million, maximum being 218 and the minimum being 50 million US dollar. As far as identification of most commonly used first name and surname are concerned, most common name was Aisha and most common surname is Tabore. And in fact, in my paper, I have written the justification and the probable reason and rationale also behind this, because this is very common surname in that part of the world, particularly Burkina Faso and South Africa. A snapshot of list of first names and last names, first name and surname, these are the most frequently ones. Identification of atomic information, there are various pieces of information that spammers seek from the prospective victims. The most important thing is that we were not able to find even a single email which talks about bank details. So this may seem contradictory, but this is the fact. And I have also given the justification why it is so. If time permits, I will also discuss about it. So this is the conclusion, that this is the average amount, this is the days, and these are the names, and most and these are the references. That's it. Thanks. Last point that I would just like to mention, as far as bank details are concerned, because anyone will feel that this is quite contradictory, but this is a typical characteristic of next of kin type of emails. In the first level, they never ask for bank details. They will just ask for the passport copy, phone number, private email ID, residential address, identification, could be driving license, and so on. So just in fact, that also leads me to the extension of this work. As part of the next stage, what we did was we sent an email to all of these spammers saying that, okay, we agree, we are ready to help you. So you can understand this is quite risky, but we did it for research purpose. And then we got the response from these spammers again. So I will say that the type of research work that has been done by researchers so far is only in the first tier of emails. That means the spam emails of next of kin type that land in our spam box. But this is the second tier, where the spammers send the mail, we respond to them, and then these spammers again respond back to us.
Jiten, please conclude and finish your presentation.
Sure. So our conclusion is that only in the second tier do they ask for the bank details, and only in the second tier of emails do they ask for some amount of money, and the average amount of money, it is not mentioned in the paper because that work was not done till that point, and later on we extended that work, and we found that the average was $1,600 US. Thank you.
Thank you, Jitin. Any question?
One question, Jitin.
Yeah.
Have you worked on a real data set or just a proposed model that you are telling now?
No, sir, this 1,562 next of kin emails are actually the mails that have actually come to our inboxes. So this is actually primary data, first-hand data.
Okay. So have we searched for other data which is maybe you have taken as a sample from all over places? May not be necessary to be in your area or in your friend circle, but maybe across. The point is, can you increase the population of your data set and then?
Yeah, definitely, definitely,
Yeah.
sir, definitely, I agree to that point. In fact, when I completed my PhD, because I was awarded doctorate in the same area, that was in the year 2009, I had collected a corpus of 36,000 emails at that point of time. But as of now, I just wanted to create a prototype to just test for this, the concept that I was talking about, the first tier of mails and the second tier of mails. And naturally, it is risky also, and then there are people who do not want to share their email IDs or are not interested in forwarding those mails. And the most critical thing is even we felt that it is quite risky because it is very risky to click on any links in those emails. But still we were able to create a corpus of 1,500. To be more specific, it is exactly 1,562. But definitely we are working in it, and as I told you that for the second year, naturally we will need more emails. And to be more specific, we have already received 364 emails as far as the second year of email is concerned. And that is why we are waiting for before working on it, because we will need to expand the data set, because then only we will be in a position to generalize the results.
Okay, thank you. My
Thank
questions
you,
are
sir.
over.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very well presented, Jatinder sir.
Thank you,
I
ma'am.
just have one question.
Yeah, please.
I like the title of your presentation, The Next of Kin. Why
Yeah.
have you used this word? How did you come around this word?
Oh, well, see, this is a standard term. As far as this next of kin term is concerned, let me be very honest and let me be very frank. This is
Related
not
to bulk
something.
emails you have used it. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a term that I have coined, but as I told you earlier also, that as far as spam emails are concerned, we have various categories. And in my research work in the year 2005, I had classified those spam emails in 14 categories. So one of those types is next of kin. Next of kin means a person in a foreign country, in a foreign land, will say that there is no relative of that person living, and some hundreds, thousands of millions of dollars are lying dormant in a bank account, and you need to present yourself from India. So that is a victim. You need to present yourself as next of kin. So I can go to my bank
Basically,
and say,
it is related to victims.
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Jitin.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Am I done?
Yes.
May I exit now?
Yes. Now I would like to invite our next presenter, is Shubhangi Rastogi. I think Shubhangi Rastogi is absent, so now move forward. Our next presenter is Kumari Sarita.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, Kumari Sarita, you are audible. And
yeah, let me share my screen.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kumari Sarita from Department of Electrical Engineering, IIT BHU. I'm here to present my paper titled Performance Enhancement of STATCOM Integrated Wind Farm for Harmonic Mitigation Using Optimization Techniques. So in this presentation, we are going to follow the steps. First, I'm going to introduce my paper, and then we will talk about power quality issues and the fax devices, the role of fax devices, and the system under study that we have considered. Then I will move to optimization techniques that I have used in this paper, and then I will discuss the results obtained, and finally I will conclude this presentation. So first, coming to the introduction section. As we know, renewable energy generation is growing all over the world, but still it has one disadvantage, that it injects grid with harmonics. Harmonics are there, present there, and it also increases the total harmonic distortion of the system. So for that, fax devices are used for the enhancement of the stability of the system. That reduces the total harmonic distortion. And the facts here used is STATCOM, which is used with the optimization techniques, that is harmonic search algorithm and invasive width optimization algorithm. So these two algorithms are used, optimization techniques are used here in this paper, and these are compared for getting the better results. And MATLAB has been used for the implementation of these optimization techniques. So second point is facts and power quality issues. So am I audible? Can I confirm?
Yes, Sarita, you are audible.
Sure.
Please go ahead.
Okay, ma'am, sure. Okay. So power quality issues that we face is we can measure it with the with the limit of THD. THD, total harmonic distortion limit. So according to ANSI IEEE 1992, the THD limit should be within these numbers for the different voltage ranges, coupling voltages. So total harmonic distortion we can express with this equation, where H is denoting the number of harmonics and N is denoting the maximum harmonic number, and V1 is the fundamental voltage. So power quality we can define in so many ways, like in supply side and in generation side. We can define it as a generation of voltage of 50 Hz frequency, and while transmitting and distributing, it can be defined as the voltage which is varying within limit of 5%, not more than that. And also we can say in term of frequency and rated voltage, that if the voltage is perfectly sinusoidal and it has a magnitude of rated voltage and frequency, then it is perfect. We can say it is good. So there are lots of problems related to qualities, power quality and losses. So to mitigate those problems, FACT devices are used, and FACT devices also suffer lots of problems. For that, we implement optimization techniques. So the system under study that we have considered is 9 megawatt wind farm system, which consists of 1.5 megawatt wind turbines, and that is connected with a 25 kilovolt distribution system, and through 25 kilovolt 25 kilovolt feeder. The frequency of the system is 50 hertz, and the nominal wind speed is 9 meter per second. So with STATCOM, we implement STATCOM as FACT device for the system under consideration. And the optimization techniques that we have implemented is, the first is the harmonic search algorithm. So in a harmonic search algorithm, we make an algorithm like we first initialize our parameters and harmonic memory space, and then we come to a iteration, closed loop iteration, that moves till we get a desired solution, and then we end up. So there it's a termination condition, that if we get a harmonic total harmonic distortion less than the previous, then we stop. And other optimization technique that we come is invasive width optimization, that is related to weights for their survival and the seeds. So it also come like that, we move in a iteration, so that we can achieve a number of iteration such that we can get a optimal solution. And the flow chart, we can see the for total harmonic distortion is, first we will start with the initial iteration, where there may be initial total harmonic distortion. Then we'll move to next iteration, and the gain values that we achieved from these two optimization technique we will use here, and then we will calculate total harmonic distortion. We will compare if the old is greater than the current THD. If yes, then we may end up with the number of iteration or the condition, or if it is equal, then we will replace. If it is no, then we will replace the old one with the current value. So coming to the result section, what we have got is we have considered two parameters, that is first the power and the second is the voltage. So power and voltage we have seen with these two implementation of optimization technique. So without any optimization technique, what we got is 73.65% of total harmonic distortion, which is very large. So here we can say noisy signal also. And after implementing our technique HSA, we got is the total harmonic distortion is reduced to 0.773 point. It is a reduction of 98.95%.
Sarita, you have only 1 minute. Please conclude your presentation.
Yeah, sure, ma'am. I'm concluding. And after implementing our technique, which is IWO, we are getting 1.739% of total harmonic distortion. So here we can commutatively, if we see that StatCom with harmonic search algorithm is giving better performance than other two. Here from waveform also we can see, we can compare. So finally we conclude that HSE is giving the better result than the IWO and with the StatCom compensator. Thank you. And these are my team members, research team members. Thank you.
Quick question I have. Thank you for presentation, and I have one question only.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So there are a lot of harmony mitigation methods available.
Yes, sir.
Like smoothing the flow, cancel out the problem, and the low cost option. So how do you compare your solution with that, and how is your solution better?
Yeah, sir, in literature, I have seen there are lots of techniques that have been used, and the percentage of lowering the total harmonic distortion, what we get from these techniques. So I have compared that the techniques that are available in literature are giving up to 1.5% or 1% like that. When I came to this technique, I got 0.7734%. That is very less than those previous technique. And then I came across the technique that is IWO also, that is giving better performance. But it also depends upon the type of loads, the system that has been implemented. So there are lots of points that we have to consider. So in this system, what we have got that these two techniques are giving better result and that are mostly used. And among these two, this is giving the best result.
Thank you, Sarita.
Thank you, ma'am.
Very good presentation. I have no questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Sarita.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now I would like to invite our next presenter. It's Asif. Asif, am I audible?
Yeah, I'm just starting my presentation. Just give me a moment, please.
Yes, please.
I hope it's visible.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, I am Asif Karim and I am here to present my research on optimization of articulated vehicular radar antenna array parameters using machine learning algorithm. And my co-author is Dr. Shanmuga Sundaram. And straight away I would like you to be taken to the problem statement. What I'm trying to achieve is propose antenna aperture tuning scheme which enables the sharing of antenna aperture between the selected long range as well as medium range ADAS applications. So to put it in a simple fashion, what I would say is like you are having two different ADAS applications, driver assist applications. That is what ADAS stands for. So here the ADAS applications I have selected are adaptive cruise control as well as pothole detection. Here the red color line in this particular figure shows the antenna beam pattern for an ACC, which generally requires a half power beam width of almost 10 degree. And for a pothole detection, for detecting all the teeny tiny potholes on the road, you require a pencil beam. So I've gone for optimized for a 0.87 degree. So this is one pair of application which I researched upon, and there are other applications which, like on the right side image, as you can see, the lane change assist, the rear cross traffic assist or blind spot detection, etc. are some of the application which you can actually attempt. And now, why is this particular topic relevant? The thing is, like, currently the automotive customers are growing more and more safety conscious, as well as our government is asking more and more safety standards to come into place. Like now ABS has come as a standard for many of the two-wheelers. So this has forced the OEMs to put more and more sensors about these automotive vehicles. So the problem is like this adds on to the cost of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, and more sensors will compete for bandage space. These are some of the problems that we have. So what I'm proposing is, or we are proposing is like, we go for an antenna which can, here we are talking about a radar, which is having an aperture, which is having multiple antennas, which can target different ADAS applications. So there, hence we will be able to tackle all these problems stated above. So how are we going to do this? So we'll be having antenna beam patterns. This is for ACC, like I've already told. This is for pothole detection, and using subarrays of n number of subarrays, we'll be making a super array, and that super array will be able to target the different ADAS applications. So with these 20 subarrays, we'll be making we'll be turning the subarray position as well as the subarray orientations, and this will result in a super array which is having various properties. Given that we are using subarrays for making the super array rather than the individual elements, the aperture is likely to be bigger. So what we are doing is we are targeting the antenna aperture to be placed on the vehicle windshield rather than the bumper, which is the normal location for placement of the antenna. And when you place these kind of antennas, you can only go for level 4 and level 5 autonomous vehicles, where you don't require a transparent kind of windshield for working. So how do you, so to summarize the approach, what I'll be doing is like, I'll be selecting long range and medium range ADAS applications, which can actually share the RF front end, then come up with a subarray which can be scaled to make the large super array. And once the super array will be made using modified genetic algorithm. And these super arrays, for example, are something like these. This is one super array designed for a pothole detection system, and this is for ACC. And here, this particular figure actually shows the super array, a sample super array generated out of square subarrays. Moving on to the next slide. So first we need to look at how we can come up with a super array. So both of us, what we did was we looked at several different subarray geometries which can actually constitute the super array. So at that time, what we were looking for was like the side lobe level of the beam pattern generated by these subarrays should be low, as well as there should be a beam symmetry. This would actually ensure that when you're making the largest super array out of these subarrays, the largest super array will also be having an even lower side lobe level as well as beam symmetry, which should be very good for ADAS applications. So finally, after considering all these things, we arrived at this particular subarray where 4 intertwined sine waves of different amplitudes and phases were intertwined, and we plotted picked up points on these sinusoids at 0.5 lambda separation. We opted for 0.5 lambda separation because from literature it was evident that if you go closer than 0.5 lambda, there is a chance of grating lobes creeping in. So
Asif, you have only 2 minutes. Please conclude your presentation.
Yeah, okay. That is one thing. And once the subarray, these are the azimuth and the optimized. Conference secretary, actually, I'm the last presenter, right? Still, you want me to conclude in a quick fashion?
Yeah, actually, we have a next session.
Okay, cool. So this is the azimuth pattern, and this is the elevation pattern. And once that we have, we need to understand what are you looking for the super array. In the super array, what you're looking at is like you need to have even lower side lobe levels and half power beamwidth, which is maximum for the ADAS application that you've selected. And these are the things that you need to keep in mind, or the constraints, like the phase centers of these are the subarrays that are plotted here. These are the phase centers, and the phase center should lie within this aperture. Otherwise, if the phase center goes out, then the element will effectively go out of the aperture. And this red arrow shows the orientation, and these omega, these x1, x2, etc. are the positions of the phase centers. Alpha 1, alpha 2 are the orientations. Again, like I already mentioned, interlement distance is 0.5 lambda, should be greater than 0.5 lambda. So mathematically, this can be put in like this, where the first term is nothing but the side lobe level, which is the ratio of the radiation pattern of the main beam divided by the maximum of the side lobe level. And the second part will actually optimize the half power beamwidth of the array. So effectively, if you minimize that, you will be able to get a super array which is to your need. Here, omega is nothing but all the individual phase centers of the subarrays and on the super array aperture as a vector, and alpha is nothing but the individual orientations. So the subarray parameters are number of subarrays, like I've told you, is 20 we have chosen. Size of the aperture is nothing but 1 meter by 0.5 meter, which is the size of the windshield itself. Then placement of this aperture is like uniform or non or sparse or whatever it is. Degrees of freedom is are you optimizing for only the position alone or position as well as orientation. Then evaluation of radiation pattern and fitness function are require some expressions which I have detailed in the paper. This is the fitness function actually, which is nothing but whatever we were trying to minimize in the objective function. And this again I have detailed in the tile parameters, again I have detailed in the paper. So these are
If kindly close the presentation, if possible, go ahead with the conclusion.
These are the last couple of slides.
As we have a limited 2-minute time, we have to start the next session at 2:15. So
okay, so this is our uniform super array ACC. For sparse array for fixed orientation, here orientation is 0. Here these are the final orientation things. And to conclude with, I would say that going with the method, we were able to find out super arrays which could actually place for co-location. Then restricting freedom, that is only position as well as position and orientation. If you change both of them, you are able to get a better optimal solution. MGA running for longer duration reduces the size of the aperture altogether. Blending multiple parent selection also again helped in striking a balance between exploration and exploitation. So with that, I have run through my presentation, and if you have questions, please feel free to.
Thank you, Asif. I have no questions for you. Thank you.
Okay.
Any question, madam? Hello.
Yeah, can you just tell me a little more?
Ma'am, you are not audible. Could you please repeat?
More about your algorithm?
Ma'am, save my.
Just move back to your slide. Hello. Yeah. Just tell me one thing. Can we increase the number of super arrays in this?
Ma'am, super array is nothing but the array that actually comes out of the optimization. You don't need to increase the super. I mean, super array. Each super array will be targeting.
Number of super arrays in this? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, kind of. You're breaking in between, but still, I could make out what you're saying. Hello.
Actually, your bandwidth is too much low, so we are not able to.
What I think, Anubha ma'am, what she wanted to know is like, can we increase the number of the subarrays? Yes, we can. But the only limitation that I had is like computational complexity. With my system that is running on i7, still almost had to run for with 720 individuals running for 7,200 iterations. It took me almost 32 hours. So if you have the resource, feel free to, no problem. It will be even better actually.
Thank you. Thank you, Asif.
No problem. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Good presentation.
Thanks, ma'am.
So now we completed all our presentations. Now I would like to invite Dr. Amit Joshi for closing remarks.
Hi everyone. I think my host has disabled my video, so I'm not able to unpin it. Anyways, no worries. Thank you very much, Dr. Anubha Jain and Dr. Prashant, for sparing your valuable time. I have seen Dr. Prashant for the last conference maybe 70 days back, and Dr. Anubha Jain maybe last year. So thank you very much, both of you, especially for valuable, because digital era, digital times are more important because you need to be concentrated on a particular screen for a particular span of time. So thank you very much for being here and patiently listening to the presenters and then commenting on their works. And thank you very much. And I would like the team to just forecast a token of appreciation to you on the screen so that
Thank you, Amit sir. It was very well organized. Even in digital mode, it was very well organized.
Thank you very much.
Even the inaugural went very well.
Great. I hope you had good takeaways from the inaugural as well. All the participants and cheers as well. So
yeah,
thank you, Dr. Amit. Yeah, ma'am, please. You please.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Amit, very much appreciated the work which has been done by your team, and your guidance is really appreciable.
Thank you very much.
I hope we will have a face-to-face meeting. Hopefully, this pandemic time.
Definitely. This digital will one day convert to physical appearances.
Yeah.
Definitely. We hope
We
that.
had a lot of talk about you with Mahalle sir and Nilanjan sir. Hopefully, we'll have a face-to-face and in-person meeting.
Definitely.
Hopefully, to meet for first doctoral symposium. Which is in August.
Surely. And I
it's
hope
not the
that
right platform to discuss, but just
definitely, sir. We will have a talk and we'll meet. And I hope that COVID-19, which we are currently facing a tremendous impact on our lives, will soon be a thing of past. And with these hopes that the new times will be much more relevant and much more beneficial to us, I would like to thank all the participants also for their valuable presentations and their contributions. Just two informations for the participants, that you will all receive the certificates, your payment receipts, and a thank you letter just after this session is over on your mail IDs. So we are not aborting or make you wait for any more for certificates, because it's all digital. So just after the session is complete, you will all receive in your inboxes. Go and just check it, the certificates. Secondly, regarding the publication of the papers, we have already submitted the data to Springer before the conference itself. So I hope that we will be able to get it published maximum by 4 to 5 months. And if in between there are any queries or we need any more information from your side, we will definitely write to you. And if you have any issues during the time, please feel free to write to our team at support@ictforsd.org or to me personally at amit@gr.foundation. I will be personally happy to assist you in the best way possible. And with these closing remarks, and with the hope that for ICT for SD 2021, we will all meet in person, I thank you once again all, and especially Dr. Prashant and Dr. Anubha Jain. Thank you very much.
Thank you and take care.
Take care all.
All of you take care. Stay healthy.
For 1 more minute it is open, so that if you want to chat or something, you can do it. After that, I ask the moderators to please close this session, because again at 2:15 there is one more session planned up, so team has to.
We would also like to thank Richa for organizing the session very well.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Richa and Aman also.
Thank you,
have
sir.
been so supportive and so helping, and I wish you all the best for the next session.
Yeah, it was nice meeting you, Dr. Prashant.
Yeah, same here, ma'am.
Keep in touch.
Yeah, sure. We will have discussion.
Thank you, sir.
No doubt. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, sir.